William, I got the recording and the live streaming warning. Are we ready to go?
We are now live.
Thank you, sir. And good afternoon, everyone. It's 1:05, so we will start this workshop of the State Historical Resources Commission. I'll bring this meeting to order. And I don't know if Shippo Blanco has any opening remarks. I will apologize for the background noise. I'm coming to you from a Panera in Fairfield, and hopefully once lunch is over, it'll be quieter in here, but otherwise I will mute myself. But Julie, do you have any opening comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to say hello to everybody and thank you for joining us today. Staff have put together a really thoughtful and interesting presentation for you today about the National Register and the different registration programs that we have, and at your request for our first workshop in the new format. So we're excited to be here and just looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Shippo Blanco. And with that, I would kick this off as our commissioner training on the National Register process. And I'm not sure what staff is going to start with this. And thank you all for being here.
Chair Adams, if it's okay, I was hoping to give a little background on the format that Commissioner Hoyos and I had proposed as the workshop committee, who kind of put these three sequential workshops in place. So is it okay if I give like a little spiel at the beginning?
Please do, Adam. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So good afternoon, everybody. Commissioner Luis Hoyos could not be here with us today. And so I was asked to provide just a brief background as to how we got where we are today and the type of content we were looking for. In past workshops for the State Historical Resources Commission, we had some really constructive discussions on how to become better commissioners and the type of information that we would be looking for as we review nominations under our purview for the National Register, the California Register, California Points of Historic Interest, and landmarks. And one of the things we talked about was, of course, what do you look at when you determine whether something meets criteria, whether you have enough information, whether there are integrity thresholds that you're looking to identify within these nominations? And how do we become better reviewers in not only the areas that we represent, but as well in areas that we don't represent, even more so? We've got some incredibly talented and qualified personnel on the commission, and it became almost a crime to not tap into them and their information for how to do this well and continue to improve as commissioners as we go through the registration process. So Commissioner Hoyos and I were both asked to put together some thoughts on what these workshops can do under that type of guidance. And we figured that the first workshop that we would ask OHP and the registration unit to put together is kind of the fundamentals of how the registration process works, specific questions that we had asked regarding integrity and criteria, and how do you help the public build a solid and defensible National Register nomination so that as we learn more about what they're looking for, we could look for similar things and understand how these nominations are polished through the process and the great work that the registration unit does in order to get that nomination in such a shape where it then becomes something that we get to review and vote on. We would then follow today's workshop as the fundamentals of how that all works with specific topic workshops from some of our commissioners to go over, now that we have an understanding about what's built into the nomination, what do we look for? What does Alan Hess look for when we talk about architecture? What do we look for in an archaeological nomination, and how do we get tribes involved so we better understand their perspective on things? So this is the first of several workshops that we've talked about putting on. Again, it's the fundamentals, it's the cornerstone of what we want to build specific topics on after that. And both Commissioner Hoyos and I thank you for the responsibility of trying to put that type of framework together. And thank you also to the registration unit who carries 95% of all of that. So appreciate all of their support as we try to craft something important for everybody. That's all.
I really appreciate the introduction to why we're here today. So why the registration unit is presenting. I think we're probably waiting for William to share the PowerPoint presentation, and then I'll begin. I'll give a very brief introduction, and there we go. And you can go ahead and start with the next slide. Just very briefly, this is the program today. I'll be talking about how nominations are vetted, submitted, and assigned. And then William's going to talk about how or nominations submitted versus those that make it to hearing. And William will also speak about the 7 aspects of integrity and thresholds of measurement. I will be speaking a little bit about criteria considerations. Amy will speak about private property owner opposition. And even more specifically, Amy will be speaking about OHP support to private property owners when they object. So in preparation for today, beginning several months ago, and our discussions with some specific discussions that we had with Commissioner SHRC and Commissioner Hoyos and Commissioner Adams. And I got the feeling that is what was wanted was just a insight into those little decisions that get made that are hard to capture. And specifically vetting, you know, how do we kind of green light something at the very beginning when we get phone calls or emails into the office. And I do a lot of that work. I kind of try to always be the public face of the unit, although I know we all do that kind of work. But so is what I've done, especially in September, there were a lot of phone inquiries. And I started realizing during some of those, you know, I'm vetting, I'm gently encouraging, I'm encouraging all phone callers. But when I see that the resource probably would not make it, I'll emphasize to the callers what they would have to document and prove in order for the nomination to have a chance. So I'm going to just very informally give a few examples. We could go to the next slide. I really encourage commissioners to interrupt, ask me questions. I hope that it's more of a dialogue. I get so tired of hearing my own voice drone on and on. So I'm going to bounce back and forth between notes. I don't have a prepared speech at all, really. I just have bullet points. This was on September 29th. I got an inquiry about a house in Los Angeles. I'm not going to get real specific on where these are. I've even obscured a few addresses in some cases. But this is a 1904 house. I feel that it might be a neoclassical row house. And I thought, you know, looking at it, you know, it's of age, right? It's obviously over 50 years of age. At first, on first glance, I thought, oh, it appears to retain integrity. But one thing I miss about not working together in the office as much is that I showed this to William a few days ago, and he immediately asked, is that pyramidal roof original? And I thought, oh, you know, I knew there was something odd. This is the synergy that goes on around here. I said, you know what? I knew there was something odd about this. And so if you look at the roof right over the porch, it looks like it was a neoclassical row house with a hipped roof, if you ask me. So then I already, just in that conversation, realized, you know, there's some integrity issues with this house. Now, I'm not going to be, my talk today isn't really about integrity, but I'm also constantly thinking, okay, here's a caller, a citizen, And I owe it to this citizen to give this person, you know, as much good service as I can. So I'm thinking, what's the neighborhood like? And you can almost see the house on the right. Go to the next slide, please, William. This is an older house, a house that's older than the neighborhood. So that intrigues me. So right away I'm thinking, you know, this is obviously a late 20s, early 30s neighborhood. What's that older neoclassical row house doing in the neighborhood? I'm thinking, wow, you know, that might cause it, discounting the change in the roof. I'm thinking that might cause it to almost be eligible on its own, perhaps, because it's unusual. It might date to an earlier land use or the very earlier development of the area in Los Angeles. So I hope this is just giving insight into how I'm thinking every day on the phone with people, trying to decide, you know, should I really encourage this person or sort of discourage the person? So I was initially thinking the house wouldn't contribute to this district, because it dates from an earlier time. William and I in our discussions, he reminded me that Paul Lesignan said just a few months ago that we should bump the period of significance back to capture a house, even though it really wasn't part of the development, the major development of the neighborhood. So in the end, let's go to the next slide. I want to see there's the house with its neighbor house. You know, I'd like to know what you guys think of my thinking. I kind of, after just thinking a little more about the roof, I don't think it would be eligible on its own. And I think that perhaps, considering Paul's recent comments, it would be a contributor to this neighborhood district, if there is in fact an intact district here. So that's where I left it, or I just, you know, I get hundreds of these calls over the course of, you know, a month or two, maybe not hundreds, but I get probably close to 100. And, you know, the chances of it moving forward are probably very slim unless this caller, who is just curious, decides to go forward with some sort of nomination. Now, because I kind of have a little bit backed off of National Register eligibility, I would say that the house might be an excellent candidate for the California Register. So anyway, I've spent enough time on this particular example. Any questions or comments about, you know, how that's just a little microcosm of how we do our business here. So.
Hey, Jay, can you please just explain who Paul Lesignan is for the audience?
I'm so sorry. Yeah.
You.
You know, there are a number of reviewers in Washington, D.C. I think there are approximately 5, maybe 8. Amy might know the correct number. And the United States is divided up amongst these reviewers, and Paul Lesignan is ours. I only know this anecdotally, but I think he's been with the Register for many decades. Paul reviews any nomination that is slightly, you know, has some unusual national level of significance, less than 50 years old, whenever a criteria consideration must be used. Those nominations get an extra review by Paul. Paul is kind of like our professor, and he constantly asks us questions when we send a nomination in, and he, you know, there's something about it that he doesn't understand, or he feels like there needs to be more explanation. And so I guess I just say all that because I've never worked with someone in his position, mostly in university situations. I feel like he's our professor mentor, he's so kind about his corrections. He tells us all the time, it's my job to help you get properties listed. So that's who Paul is. And anyway, any other questions or comments? Janet had something, or Alan? Yeah, I hate to, whoever raised their hand first, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'll go ahead. I was just wondering, and I know maybe you were talking about just an initial reaction and an initial phone call, but would there be a situation where you might just take a minute, even online, and could do it even on the phone, where you would look up a property? For example, you know, in Los Angeles, you have Survey LA, so you could immediately know how it was or was not part of that survey, if there might have been a district there, if it was in fact identified as part of that survey.
You know, Janet, it's something that I really probably could do a lot better. I probably wouldn't think to go to Survey LA, but I certainly should look at our database more often to see if the property's been evaluated. But then again, I'm probably basing these quick analyses on my prior experience, what I think would make it through the process, what would make it through your scrutiny, and what certainly would make it through the National Register scrutiny.
Yeah, it occurs to me that, a lot of the National Register process is this sort of compared to what, and the compared to what is going to be very different in different communities, where you may have a property like this that in one community, it might be much rarer than it would be perhaps in the city of Los Angeles, which is so incredibly huge. Anyway, just a couple of thoughts.
No, absolutely. And you bring up something, geographically, especially the last 2 years, I bend over backwards when I get calls from Fresno, Modesto, Hanford, McLeod up north. And we can say, the criteria are the criteria, but, they're not edicts or laws. There is flexibility. And we get no nominations from the central areas of the state, the far north, the desert areas. I mean, almost no. So yeah, you're right. I will encourage them more. And the resource might not be individually eligible in a big city like Los Angeles, but that's the beautiful thing about local level, at the local level of significance, when there's such a smaller housing stock, yes, it might be eligible for the National Register. Before I go to Alan, think about the house on the right. I couldn't call that National Register eligible individually, but maybe California Register eligible. So that would be my off the cuff analysis of the house on the right. Yes, Alan?
Okay, well, this is good because I want to get into your thinking about these things, and you obviously are well educated in this area and practiced. So I'm wondering, on the building on the left, just hypothetically, you think by William's suggestion it might have had been one story with a pyramidal roof on it originally,
yes,
and then this hip roof was added at some point. So then you go directly to like integrity, so it's been changed. So that would be a problem for something like that.
Oh, I think it gives me pause. For that house, that roof is a pretty dramatic change. I don't think of it as much different than putting a second story on any potentially historic house. Also, I would say that the more I look at it, the camphor tree kind of messes, you can't really see it, but the more you look at it, it looks like it was maybe done in the real recent past. And by that, I mean in less than 30 years, which really means that it hasn't gained significance in its own right. Correct? Yeah. Am I answering is this helping?
Yeah. So you're thinking of if it had been, we're talking strictly architecturally here.
Yes, we are. Yes.
If it had been a pure original example of a pyramidal cottage, for example, then that would have been more positive. But you're looking for some sense of purity, of example of a style, period, etc.
Yeah, the word purity certainly makes me a little nervous. It just has to embody the distinctive characteristics of. But yes, I would look for a better example. But you also brought up something else, and here I'm always preaching criterion A, and you just made me realize that in preparation for this presentation, I wasn't even thinking. And so let's throw that wrench into the works. the caller told me that this was, for some reason this pops in my mind because the house that I know as an example is about this simple. This is where, oh, for gosh sakes, the actress who played Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, help me.
Oh,
Judy Garland.
This is where Judy Garland lived for the first 4 years of her life. Let's throw that into it.
Okay.
As I've gotten calls like that. So right away, I think, oh, maybe they're, but then then my next thought is, well, that wasn't those weren't her productive years, really, right? I mean, property associated with an individual should, be associated with their productive lives. So let's say criterion, the caller told me that this was the office of, the first office of a Hollywood mogul, despite that new roof, criterion A has a lesser threshold, and it's still recognizable as the place. It's been altered, but would the mogul who walked up to her home that she had for the first 10 years of her career, would she recognize it? Yeah, probably. So then let's bring up this is kind of the third rail. What happens if this house does have some integrity issues, and there's going to be extremely strong opposition? The nomination is going to have to be very well written. All the I's have to be dotted, the T's have to be crossed. So, it potentially could have a historical architectural firm writing an opposition for it. So, all these things are rapidly going through my mind as I'm talking to people on the phone. I hope Amy and William feel free too to, we're so fortunate that we work so well together. We're always reminding each other of things, and we're this little miniature think tank here, and so chime in if I'm missing something or mischaracterizing something. But I'm a little worried about time. I don't want to. I have about 8 properties, but I could also skip quickly over some of those. Let's go to the next property. Oh, Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, Jay, really quick. When we talked about this house, you had originally said that, you could also look at it in the context of a district, and perhaps on its own merit, it wouldn't raise to the level of National Register eligible under criterion C, but in a district situation, it might actually meet that larger criteria that you would look at from a district perspective. When you brought up criterion B, does that come into play when looking at a district from an architectural perspective, or is that completely separate and that would really only play in if you were looking at the house on an individual basis?
I think the latter is correct.
Okay.
Because if it contributes to the district, it would be eligible for listing as a contributor. And so it would be the criterion B issue would only arise, unless I'm misthinking this, it would only arise for an individual listing. Now, if you were going to try to, I can't see this scenario, but if in the nomination for the district, you were saying part of the significance of the district arises from the fact that Judy Garland lived in one of the houses during the first 4 years of her life, I probably would ask the applicant. Here's a good example of how we work here. I probably would ask the applicant to remove that from argument for significance and put it in the background section of the nomination.
That makes sense. Okay, thank you.
So all of this is going on behind you. See, I hope this gives insight for all you that this is the stuff that's going on constantly here. This I love. This is in McLeod. I got 2 inquiries from McLeod up by Mount Shasta within a day in September. September was a weird month, if I may say. And so immediately, this is perplexing, right? It obviously has these weird bones that make it look like early 20th century, late 20th century. But I'm looking at the windows with great skepticism, especially the middle tripartite, just strange. And I almost, on initial thought they were fake window grids, window mullions, or mint, and I just can't stand that. But again, it's McLeod. This is a couple who moved up from a different urban area because they liked McLeod, bought the building. There's another context that's mind-blowing. This was one of the national and internationally known centers for square dancing in the last 4 to 5 decades. So go to the next slide, please. So look at the picture. I mean, I stared at this darn building for a week before I figured this out. Maybe go back one again. The more I looked at it, I'm like, wow, it really has high integrity. It's just had this 2nd-story balcony slapped on. So I think the building, go on to the next slide, please. And then even go to the next one. Look at the window on the left. I was just blown away and pleased as punch. The windows are original, I believe. And so that means all those windows in the front are original. Look at the ceiling too. Go to the next slide, please. The building has high integrity, and it probably is significant also for its interiors. It was also an Oddfellows hall. I haven't told you that. So again, I'm on the phone, I'm hustling, talking to these applicants and really encouraging them to move forward on a nomination. I can't remember. Let's see, I have 3. Oh no, I'll go to the next one, please. So in the next one, back, sorry. I had some shots of the side of the building. In order to shorten the presentation, I took those out. But the rest of the building has integrity also. So I think, considering McLeod, totally underrepresented when it comes to National Register properties, the fact that the balcony is removable, reversible, really no damage to historic fabric to speak of. It was an Oddfellows hall. I didn't tell you, I guess, that I think it was built just after the turn of the century. I would totally support this for the National Register, for criterion A, if anything, for its role that it played in the social fabric of McLeod. Depending on when the square dancing context began, there might be some eligibility based on that. But it's kind of a odd looking building. I don't know. I have a feeling that we probably won't see a nomination for it. That's why I feel comfortable showing it to you. Anyway, any thoughts, anybody, before we move on?
It looks like a community hall in a country town to me.
That's great to hear, because I'm
with all of its sort of peculiarities. I think that's what's so charming about this building type and their function in communities, that they just all have their own sort of quirky personalities, but they serve such a function in the towns and the hearts of the people, and gathering and celebration and those kinds of things. So I think it's a great example of that kind of architecture and its place in community. Hey Jay, at some point I wonder if you might, or if somebody might put up the criteria for the National Register, what the different criteria are for the folks who might be following along who don't know what criterion A, B,
oh
C,
boy, yeah, good idea. One of my colleagues would have to maybe pull the pages offline, and I'm not sure how we could share that quickly. Could you do it without a lot of trouble, William or Amy?
No.
Sorry.
I'll try to do it, and I'll try to do it and share my screen. Keep talking.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Okay, I'll keep going. But maybe I'll try to. Yeah, go ahead.
It's not related to this particular property, but you said something interesting when you showed the interior photo and the windows, and you said the windows look original.
Go back one, William, if you can. Yeah.
We don't need to see the image for the question to happen, but
okay.
In a situation where we have a property on discussion and there's objection to a property, and the argument is it's modified more than you think, and we feel that the windows aren't original, but yet the nominator says they are. So you have a very black and white situation here where you have probably 2 architectural historians pointing out 2 different arguments that then need to be sorted out for the commission to understand exactly how much integrity is retained. Does the registration unit go through any type of additional research on behalf of support or opposition to try and include the results of that research into the nomination to help settle that type of dispute?
Boy, it's kind of a tough question. I almost have to have it repeated. You mean participate? I mean, we don't do research from our desks here. I mean, we just don't feel like we have the time, or we can't travel. But if I understand your question correctly, it better be laid out well in the description section. And certainly we would verbally and in writing ask the applicants, the preparers of the nomination, to, if we had questions, we would, hey, it looks like those windows were changed. Could you please discuss that? Because that's what's going to happen when we send the nomination to Washington. So maybe on the back end, Adam, and not as much on the front end. If I had a question, I would ask we would push it off to the preparer. They have to research it and let us know, right?
Right. If opposition comes in that way, though, and let's say the nomination is done and you feel like it's met all of its requirements, but then opposition comes in and is starting to argue against some of the points in the nomination, do you then go back and have them double check? Or, I mean, is there a way of, I don't know, maybe bringing these two parties together and say, clearly there's a discrepancy. Can we work together, or is there a process to follow, or do we just wait for that to play out at the meeting for us to hear and make a call?
Boy, I mean, we certainly never would. I've never experienced us getting the opposition and the proponents together. A lot of opposition. I mean, letters that we receive just flat out say, there's nothing historic about this, and
Sure.
nothing important happened here, and so it's sometimes hard to argue that, especially for properties that clearly meet the criteria. I mean,
Right.
it's all, and I have to tell you, it almost knocks your pins out from under you. You're like, how do you even argue with that? There's nothing. This is not historic. But more specifically to changes, I mean, I think that the fabric's either there or it's not there. I could see asking for better photographs. We do take, I mean, at a certain point, we take things on face value. I mean, that people aren't lying, that are not, that are saying that the building has integrity. And I don't know. I sure, if Amy or William could chime in, I
do have one example of that. Actually, the Glide Church a couple of years ago, when it was individually nominated, of course, it was already a contributor to the Tenderloin District. But when it was first nominated by the city of San Francisco, the property owner had some concerns, and we actually held a series of Zoom meetings and discussing what nomination meant and what was in the nomination. And it did require some iterative discussion, and generally the burden of revision and making changes that required things like going and taking photographs or doing additional research was placed upon the applicant. We'll talk more about that in general in my portion, but it ended up satisfying the concerns of the property owner. And of course, as you know, the property was listed. So there are examples where bringing people to the table in advance has worked, but it's really, we're not, it's something that requires a certain level of willingness from the parties involved to do so, and we can't obviously force that.
Yeah. Thanks, William. That's great.
I've had situations too with some interaction between preparers and opposition, because as a matter of courtesy, we share the letters that come in with the preparers. And especially if there's a letter that says that, either the boundary should be redefined, or they're questioning something that is presented factually in the nomination, I do ask the preparers for their input. And sometimes there is a little bit of revision that happens as a result of that.
Yeah, and Adam, I also think it's important to remember that this is not the Section 106 consultation process that we follow for reviews. It's National Register nomination. So, and then secondly, that they are not the nominations aren't the nominations of the state. They're not from our office. They come from the public. So we're administering a process, not actually doing the nominations ourselves. And so that sort of consultative process that you are requesting doesn't have there's no process in the National Register for that kind of process. I will say though, I did pull up the National Register bulletin that has the criteria, and if I might share my screen so we can see it. Jay, maybe you can walk us through these.
Sure, yeah. And in fact, I think it's a good idea, Julie, to clearly articulate.
Okay, so somebody else is sharing their screen, so I can't share mine.
You should be able to do it now. We'll just be ending the presentation.
Thank you. Okay, can you all see that?
Oh, yeah, good. Maybe go to the next page, if you can.
Okay.
And a couple, just keep going. And I think I'm glad that we're doing this because, especially in the environmental review process, you'll read reports that say, this isn't a good example, or, and really, I live by the bold text underneath Criterion A event. And the introduction to this bulletin talks about how the National Register, the criteria are broadly written to be able to take in a wide variety of resources and style, not just style, but condition. It's a national census. And so I try to emphasize that we're not coming to take your property away. It's the beginning of a national census. And so it's broad, and you can see, properties can be eligible for the National Register if they are associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. And I'll add, at the local level, really, right? So in a small town like McLeod, you could almost argue that every surviving building downtown might have played a significant role. When the hardware store opened, when, maybe Montgomery Ward's opened a branch, or a J.C. Penney's. I mean, those are big things for a tiny little town. So anyway, let's try B. And it'll probably be a few pages. Yeah. And then again, this is B is the more difficult criterion to nominate under, because the property has to be, as we discussed earlier, there's some specific criteria that must be met. But maybe back up one more page. Let's read that. This page. Yeah, properties may be eligible for the National Register if they are associated with the lives of persons significant in our past. And again, I would remind people, we only have to discuss the significance of these persons within a local context. And then the one that most people associate the National Register with, if you go down just a couple of clicks, I can read I could even read it from my book down a little. Properties may be eligible for the National Register if they embody the distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, or that represent the work of a master, or possess high artistic values, or that represent a significant and distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction. So those are the three main criteria. But there is, you want to read, should I read archaeology, Adam? And Renee? Properties may be eligible for the National Register if they have yielded or may likely to yield information important in prehistory or history. So anyway, thanks, Julie.
Thank you. And that's National Register Bulletin number 15.
Yeah, 15. How to apply the National Register criteria. And I'll try to, the next house I have was a phone call that I got on September 26th. I'll just say generally it was in a community east of San Diego. And it's kind of a unusual house. Are you putting up the slideshow again, William?
Jay, while we're waiting, I can see the corn above your head, but I'm wondering if that's part of Joaquin Murrieta and the other jar behind you.
Yeah, don't tell anyone. So this was a very nice person that called me and wanted to know about potential eligibility of the house. And this is the best photograph that I could pull offline. Or no, it was actually sent to me. And so again, just thinking out loud, my first response was, well, it might be actually, as I'm looking at it even again right now, you know, some of the decorations on the columns of the porch roof look like they might have kind of more of a modern millwork attached to them, but I could be wrong. I can't tell. I would have to have those things addressed really before I even told the person to go forward with a nomination. The very first thing I wondered about when I saw this house was whether the porch was original. I'd be willing to bet that the built-in portion of the porch was not original, but just by the way the windows are arranged, that kind of 3-2 pattern, there's just some indications to me, just my gut, that says that that fill-in might have been early, you know, maybe earlier in the mid 20th century or earlier, but I don't know. But the Inquirer called it a plantation style house. I actually pulled down the main reference book yesterday, and I don't know, I think it might even be an American vernacular with hipped roof. But as it stands right now, looking at it, I could not recommend that this be nominated to the National Register. I would have to know a lot more about it, how original it is. What am I looking at here? Is the whole roof line original? When was that porch filled in? Or was it built like that originally? How about I don't know, it looks to me like there's some turnings holding up the porch and they don't appear original. I would need more information. But in an effort to encourage someone like this, I think the next slide is basically the same. You can go to it. I would say, you know, I think there very well might be California Register possibilities for this house. Again, I really would need to know a little bit about it. I'll go so far as to ask prospective applicants to submit a summary statement of significance, a paragraph. Tell me why you think, here's the criteria. Please tell me why you think it might meet the criteria. But this is a tough one, you know. I don't have enough information, but I certainly, houses weren't built like this in the last 50 to 75 years. Very unusual. I don't think it doesn't appear new enough to be a 1990s copy of a ranch house of some sort, right?
Jay, does it happen often that somebody comes in with a National Register nomination and perhaps it just doesn't hold enough in historical significance for that level, and you encourage them to shoot for the California Register?
You know, we don't keep statistics because so much of it is done verbally and, quick emails. You'll see that we don't have a whole lot of California Register nominations, so it can't happen a whole lot. Some of it's self-canceling. I mean, a lot of the queries are from folks that probably don't have experience writing enough to submit one. So, and also one thing I wanted to convey today is that there are no hard and fast no's, and we don't get hard and fast no's from Washington very infrequently. It's more like, can you tell us more about this? Maybe this place has a really amazing intact interior from the Craftsman era. It might be able to stand on its own with that. I doubt it, but So it's not a direct answer to your question. I think I've given this some thought in just the last 48 hours. A lot of times is what happens is the nomination sits on our inventory list because the author really can't make the case, but we still have hope. You know, we're a public, I just take that so seriously. We're here to serve. And I'm not just trying to ingratiate ourselves, you know, and so we're not, rarely do we really send nominations back. We have that option. There's even letters in our files, template letters. Sorry, we don't think it makes it, you know, but we don't do that too often. Maybe move on to the next slide. I will, it'll be an hour here. So what am I going to say to this? Send it in, you know, as soon as possible.
Is that house in Woodland, Jay? That
Where?
looks familiar.
No. And it's pristine. But then someone, you know, puts little doubts in my brain. Someone yesterday, I don't know, something came up and they, you know, how do you know it's not all brand new? And they didn't just purchase it all at Blue Ox in Humboldt County. You know, I don't think so. I mean, look at it. Look at the chimney. I don't think you could find anyone to make an authentic Victorian chimney. It's just the fact that those chimneys survive with their caps like that on them. So you could just go through this one rather quickly. I hope that I see, you know, I hope we see a nomination. Now, I wanted you to see the interior. I mean, it's crazy. Look at all the cut glass. So here, this actually, the interiors actually, you could see the wallpaper at the top looks to me like it may be from the company in Benicia that still that has a business reproducing these.
Bradbury and Bradbury.
Bradbury and Bradbury. Thank you. And then the cut glass. I mean, no, I see. You got me questioning myself. Is the cut glass more modern? Because people can still do it, but no. So I tell people green light it. What happens if it's the person down the street that called me? My first question, have you spoken to the owners? Well, no, not yet. I'm like, well, we really, I mean, there's nothing in the law that says they have to, but let me tell you, I tell them in the strongest words possible while still being a good public servant that it's going to cause a lot of problems, consternation, lawyers could get involved. But that's the art. That's what I'm doing. That I don't even like to, can't even say, you know, you can, you know, verbally on the phone, I could be a little more straight up. Questions, comments? We'll go to the next house quickly.
Well, I think just to that comment about property owners in opposition, we're administering a law. It's not a subjective thing that we're deciding. It's the framework the National Register has given to all 50 states. And so we really are following what has been provided to us. And our job is to make sure that the process is followed as much as the properties that are being nominated meet the criteria for significance and integrity. So sometimes it's hard to explain that to property owners in a way that makes them understand when they're not pleased about their property being nominated. But the law is pretty clear about what our role is and where the bumpers are for it, that we're supposed to keep that ball going down the lane. So I'll just add that a little bit to the conversation.
I've called owners, you know, I can think, I have a strong memory of once, but I know I've done it probably 3 times, you know, and said, hey, you know, even before we send the notice, we've received a nomination. So this is, I actually have changed things up. This is actually the president's house at Chico State, and it's a Julia Morgan, by the way. It's been rehabbed since this picture. It's a kind of an entertainment center for the university. I think probably they use it a lot in their fundraising and maybe scholarly meetings. But let's pretend like it's a fraternity house on the campus of a private university. Let's pretend that the university or the private university owns the house. And I have an applicant that's very serious about nominating it because it's the first fraternity that was integrated in the United States, or just say the Western US even. You know, so now suddenly you have a house that's privately owned, nominated by a third party, but this highly significant, prescient, you know, current event important context. I again, it kind of riffs off of the last or our last discussion. I encourage the applicant to open dialogue with the property owner. I cross my fingers and hope that the property owner doesn't, get really upset. What would happen if it was just a fraternity house on a private property campus and they just want to nominate it for its architecture? Boy, in today's world, I wouldn't tell them they can't, but verbally on the phone, I would say, you have to write a seriously airtight nomination and be ready for a lot. And then we're going to put up, we're going to be subject to a lot of consternation. So again, I don't know that I'm giving you any hard and fast answers, but this goes through my mind every hour of every day when I'm dealing with these things. Questions or comments before I go to the next property?
Well, Jay, I think that's the point, right? It's like each property, each case is different, and that you have to do your due diligence based on what you're seeing in front of you. It's pretty amazing, but also at the same time, you're the expert, and it goes to show you, well, I don't know about this, that, or the other. And that just means that this is no straightforward process, and it's something where wisdom and experience and an understanding of a piece of property or a district within the context of the broader state, within the context of the broader nation, is really important. So having the stability and the expertise that the staff has right now, it's just, we're lucky.
Oh, thank you, Renee. I can't thank you enough, because I feel like we're flying by the seat of our pants, but I hope it makes sense. Thank you.
Thanks for saying that, Renee. And I'll just agree that our award-winning registration unit staff, while Jay might say that they're flying by the seat of their pants, I think he's really very modest. They have a lot of depth and experience in the field, and also have, at the beginning where Jay talked about Paul Lusignan and the National Register, the keeper of the National Register's office, they have a sense of the depth of experience that those reviewers are looking for. It's important to keep in mind that while we're running the process and you're all making an assessment of integrity and significance, it's a recommendation to the keeper that you're making. So the listing actually happens in Washington. So you're sending a recommendation over, and you're sending it to people that our staff know pretty much over the years have begun to understand what they think is significant and what will meet the criteria and what will not. So even though all the work is happening, we are lucky to have such a smart, intelligent, and thoughtful staff. We are making collectively recommendations to the keeper, and that knowledge of what the keeper is looking for and what they've done in the past is also a very important component of the recommendations that staff make to you all as commissioners.
Thank you. So this is actually, I'll go through this one pretty quickly. This is actually a state park property, but it's on the coast north of Santa Cruz. I got a call from a fellow a while back interested in the National Register, and it was for a dairy ranch house. I didn't see an image, so I have no idea. That's why I just picked out something that I imagine it might be similar to. And I knew that it was it was an very early 20th century or late 19th century house. I think it might have been late 19th century. So right away, I'm like, well, dairy property, northern coast of Santa Cruz. We like that. Does it have integrity? Yes, it has high integrity. But I'm about ready to make some improvements. But first, though, I heard how wonderful the materials are that the house is made out of, which of course we all know. Although people always think that the framing's redwood, 90% of the time the framing's Douglas fir and the envelope is redwood. But the person was about, if I understood him correctly, was about to engage in wholesale replacement of the exterior siding with a modern material. and kind of listening again between the lines when I kept hearing, improving it. And, the old windows need improving. And so I got the idea that maybe there was going to be wholesale replacement of all the windows. And so a rare situation where I just really didn't encourage, I said, I don't think it would be eligible. I couldn't support it for National Register listing if all the windows and all the siding were replaced with modern materials. So I just wanted you to hear that one. That's all. That's just 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. So very current. I want you to be sitting in the chair with me right now. So it's very current. Anyway, I've been all through this. Before I came to OHP, I was down here doing a little bit of investigating for the, I always say state parks proper, or the acquisition and development division. So this is the Wilder Ranch. There's like the original stove. This place is so incredibly, it's a time capsule. We go to the next slide, move on. Oh, I just couldn't wait to show you all this one. So this was a neat email inquiry just a few weeks ago. See if I have the date, September 29th. And the person said this statue is in numerous TV shows. This is in Venice, by the way. It's so recognizable. It has to be historically significant. It's been on TV shows, movies. And so the person was very kind because she didn't know about the 50-year threshold. And so I've spent a lot of time, more time than I would normally look at it because I wanted to use it today. So take a look. I mean, I think it's pretty easy when you look at the materials, the orange columns with the Corinthian capitals, with this plain square plinths, the windows, just the whole arrangement, the square top of the tower. It looks like a Alan can help me, but it's a late 80s, 90s building, I would say. Maybe.
Yeah, I think I remember when this was built, and then probably, I guess, the 80s or so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but then me, I feel bad. Actually, the person was very gracious, said, I love the way the caller said, it's going to be eligible one day. And I thought, right on, then call us back. But then I start second guessing myself. Hey, you never know. Could it meet criteria consideration G, properties less than 50 years old? If that statue played a role in creating a whole new genre of building decoration, and there's been some academic research done on it,
Well, I might be wrong, but I think it was a fairly well-known artist who did the figure.
Right. And then we would have to discuss, though, Alan, is it really part of the design of the building, or because we avoid nominating artwork, right? But if it's part of the architecture of the building, I would say, well, it's part of the architecture. Go to the next slide, please. I did this on purpose because, who's going to argue that the Disney building wouldn't be eligible maybe in 30 years? And the Buckaroo on the bottom right was actually constructed or installed as a part of the architecture of a building here in Sacramento. And the cow the building's been completely altered or the steer and put at an angle, but in this building's past life, that steer would have been a contributor to this building. So yeah, I agree. I mean, it's a little too new, the Venice building, but I could imagine scenarios where it could be eligible. I don't think it is, but I don't know. What do you all think of this example?
Well, it's related to the whole issue of programmatic architecture in California. For example, also in Venice is the advertising agency Chiat Day by Frank Gehry with giant binoculars by Klaus Oldenburg. So that's kind of one part of the spectrum. Famous architect, famous artist. So, yeah, that might be a bit easier to nominate, but then the cow here is like on the other end of the spectrum. But where do you divide the line and say historic, non-historic?
Well, I mean, Alan brings up some good points, and and I suppose taste shouldn't reflect in these things, but taste is a personal thing, and I really love that steer. The other things, I don't know, but that's why it's such a difficult thing. So how far you might be willing to help a client, or not a client, you know what I mean, a potential nominator, move toward getting it something at least submitted into a nomination, might reflect your own personal taste at times. But I know it probably doesn't, because you probably know how to keep your personal preferences out of it, if that's possible. I don't know, but I would have a problem because of my taste level is pretty bad. So
the Venice Clown, by the way, was Jonathan Borofsky, 1989.
Okay, yeah, so real new. And that makes it sound like it might have been applied after the building was constructed.
They associate it with the 3-story building that it sits upon.
Interesting. So consider too, though, if you had really strong opposition to, I mean, that plays a role. These are this is a very marginally eligible property, if at all. And anyway, there's interesting things to talk about. The next, I think I'm actually almost done. Go to the next slide, please. And just a quick recap of this. I actually put these slides up here for those of you that love mid-century modern architecture. This is the Fireman Funds Insurance Building in San Francisco. It started out as a nomination of UC property, University of California. And I think it's easily eligible. It's just this magnificent, show the next slide, please, example of mid-century modern. I love the courtyard. It's beautifully done. Next slide. And so I guess this isn't as much of a discussion on this building of whether it's eligible or not, or my thinking processes, but it's an example of how we start out kind of innocently. We know because it's government owned that although agencies or sections of the government or local government can object quite vociferously, for National Register purposes, the National Register tends to list, or they will list over the objection. But then mid-nomination process, the property came under the control of private developers and it got controversial. And it actually, for a while, it looked like it was going to be really, it ended up not being too controversial. But I just wanted to use it as an example of how we're just lollygagging, going along, and then suddenly, opposition comes when we don't know that it's going to come. So let me see if I quickly before I wrap up my session, and I feel bad I guess it wasn't too long. You had asked about how nominations are assigned. Nominations most always come to my desk. We all kind of discuss it together mostly. And we all have our strengths and interests. And so, it's not perfect. Sometimes one of us will do a nomination when maybe Amy really loves that type of resource. But generally, we jump at the chance to work a nomination for a type of property that we like and that we know a lot about, that context and that building type. And also, Amy pointed out that a lot of times there's prior communication. You took the phone call, you helped the person multiple times. So when the nomination comes in, you're kind of the most knowledgeable to take that nomination. And then also, I should have put this one first, a workload. It's based on workload a lot too. So nothing too scientific. What's that?
Jay, it's not based on who you're mad at that week.
No, I couldn't. No, I think they have the right to be more mad at me. They could throw it back on my lap. So I'll put it to rest, and I'm I'm kind of anxious to hear the next portions of the presentation.
Thanks, Jay. Any final questions or comments for Jay, other than he did a great job?
Great job, guys. Thank you, Jay. I was going to just say that the Disney building where the Seven Dwarves, where the columns, was designed by Michael Graves. And it was one of, I think, the last buildings he designed. Is that right, Alan? Anyway, so to throw another sort of wrench in the conversation, what happens when it's a significant architect and that's part of a criteria that might sort of be the guiding one in that particular nomination.
Yeah, and I realize I'm a little remiss and not even, I didn't even ask this person, who the architect or the designer of the dancing clown was. I mean, I'm just going off of age, the fact that it's a work of art, so anyway.
All right. Well, thank you for your patience, and we're back on to the presentation. And my portion will hopefully answer some of the questions that were raised during Jay's presentation, and hopefully spur others. So feel free to raise your hand or chime in if you have questions regarding how nominations are reviewed and evaluated before presentation to the commission, and then how integrity is measured and evaluated in a National Register nomination. The checklist for submission is generally where we point any applicant when they're considering doing a nomination. Jay, I know, handles a lot of calls and sometimes will go into depth, but our general advice for members of the public, if they're interested in nominating a property, is that we don't provide substantive evaluation prior to submittal. The idea is that we want to encourage you to actually write the nomination and submit it rather than send us half-completed drafts. We answer technical questions for how to fill out various portions of the form, but generally we want to see a completed nomination and this checklist followed. When it is received in our office, this checklist is what we use to verify that all the information in the nomination is there and is complete. It's not an evaluation of its significance or the property's integrity, but a mechanical process. Is it on the current version of the form? National Park Service revises the NPS 10900 form every 3 years, and they insist that continuation sheets be used for additional pages. So we need to make sure that it's on the current version of the form. We have had issues where the NPS said this is on an older version of the form. So that's one of the things the first things we look for. Have they done the photographs to the correct resolution and standard? Digital photographs are now pretty much the basis for all of our nominations. We don't see people submitting black and white actual camera photography on photo paper anymore, but the digital photographs are still a kind of a technical field, and often members of the general public, pretty much everybody has cell phones that are capable of taking photos of that resolution, but sometimes submitting them is still a challenge. And then figures and historic photos and other sorts of additions that belong in the text of the nomination, because sometimes they'll be separate from the text, which means they're not in the document that's submitted for review. So a lot of our initial consultation and what things we look for are this kind of mechanical problem before we even get to the question of, is the property eligible? Mapping is also an issue, and having correct maps that, for a district especially, that identify contributors and non-contributors in a simple and logical way. And then photography, or in addition to the photographs, using satellite photography, sources like Google Earth for location instead of using USGS maps. We're required to be backwards compatible. If someone really wanted to submit a National Register nomination, typewritten on paper with a USGS printed map with the location marked in pencil, theoretically they could. It would be a lot of work on our end to get it into a state where it could be reviewed and submitted and especially posted to the public. We'll talk about ADA compliance a little later. But we want to ensure accessibility to everyone regardless of their technical skill. But you still have to have the academic skill. My previous career, some of you know, before I was a historian, was as a social worker, and I was a case manager. And the principle of case management is that a case manager can guide a client where they want to go, providing knowledge and assistance and reference and support, but they can't make the journey for the client. And that's the principle that we use, is we do the technical review. We can provide advice on how to get things up to technical spec and where to look for the information, but we can't find the information for them. Substantive review involves analysis of the property description in Section 7, the areas of significance, and assessment of its integrity. And then, as we mentioned, is it complete? Do descriptions match the photos? Does what is in the nomination make sense? And we'll talk about integrity more a little bit later. And this is an example of a nomination that actually was returned, the Kremer Hotel in Santa Cruz County. It was a 19th century building, originally wood framed, that later received an exterior stucco application. And the applicant essentially wasn't able to follow up and provide revisions that explained why it was still eligible after a dramatic change in the interior, and whether or not that still kept significant, was able to express its significance. It may well be significant, and someone with either a little more experience in writing historic context or just a little more time might have been able to do so, but in the end we ended up returning it for inactivity. When we do return, if the property is clearly ineligible, which is very rare, very rarely do we receive a nomination for something that we go, this just isn't going to fly. Or the applicant doesn't have sufficient skills, and sometimes this will happen even in the case of a consultant. Or for inactivity. Sometimes you get a nomination, it has problems, you send a request for information, and you never get a response. If we don't get a response for sufficiently long, we can wait a year or two. We're generally not in a hurry to move nominations forward unless there's some kind of time pressure issue. That if something's inactive for too long, though, we don't want it sitting on the end of our caseload, and so we will return if we don't get a response or if the person isn't responding to our questions. We'll send a request for information letter or RFI letter if we're asking for significant technical revisions. If the property looks like it's potentially going to be eligible, but the documentation isn't thorough enough, and if we have follow-up questions asking for more details. And when we do edit a nomination, and we do actually do a certain amount of editing and modification of the nomination, is if they're minor revisions, are common technical errors. If someone isn't really familiar with Microsoft Word, and the nomination forms we deal with are all based on Microsoft Word, it's a better use, I think, and I think you'll agree, of the state's time and the public's time if we spend half an hour correcting a margin or redoing a header than spending weeks or months communicating back and forth with an applicant who doesn't have those technical skills. It's just faster to do it that way. And in some cases, we provide some technical expertise, such as a summary paragraph. There's almost a formulaic summary paragraph that goes in any National Register nomination, and very often people will turn a summary paragraph into a summary 10 paragraphs. Which is not what we want, but it's a very easy thing for us, once we've read the nomination, to turn it into a summary. Or the fine points of architectural description, for those who aren't architectural historians, can be kind of a challenge. But again, it's something fairly simple for us because we deal with it every day. And so we will advise the applicant, we've made these changes and this is what we've done. But sometimes, yes, we do a certain amount of writing, but we don't do research. We don't go to libraries. We don't go and check primary sources. We don't go do site visits. We don't have the time or the budget or the energy to do that, and it isn't necessarily appropriate to do. So we help where we can, but there's plenty of places where we can't. One final area of editing that's come into much greater practice in the past couple of years are state laws that require that any document that a state agency posts on its website has to be ADA compliant. It needs to be accessible for all people to be able to read. And that often means making physical changes to the document, which can't be done on the applicant's end because they have no idea of these state laws or how to follow them. And they're often things that you don't know until you've run an automated check and done follow-up of the PDF that is produced from that Word document. So that does also require physical editing, and it requires time. But it's state law, and it makes our program more accessible to everyone. So it's absolutely within the purview of what we want to do as part of our mission. As I said, we don't do site visits, we don't verify every source in the bibliography, and we don't do anything requiring independent research. We do consider, when we're reviewing a nomination, are there potential threats to the resource? Is it a rare example of a type, or are there unique situations? And every property, in some ways, is a unique situation, as was mentioned earlier. And sometimes you can have two properties that are very similar, and one would be eligible and one would be not because of those slight differences that aren't necessarily obvious. I'm almost resistant to the idea of looking at a photograph and being able to say immediately whether or not a property is eligible or not. I look at a photograph and I ask, what questions do I have about this property? What are the things that I want to know? What are the things that I would need to see accompanying a nomination in the text, which takes time to evaluate and digest before making a decision regarding our recommendation of eligibility? Because we don't endorse, we don't make a formal evaluation. Certain parts of our office do, and certain of our programs do. Section 106 and Section 110, they are providing a formal determination of eligibility very often, or a verification or concurrence of an evaluator's determination, which does have a lasting effect. As the registration unit, we don't do that, and our recommendation does not change the legal status of the property. Well, neither really, as the SHPO mentioned earlier, neither is the decision of the commissioners. It's a recommendation. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. This is when you see the nominations, they have a recommendation and what we think, but it's not a final determination in any way. And this is another returned nomination for a mid-century school, which very well could be eligible, but the applicant wasn't able to make the case for eligibility under any criteria. So it was sent back. Section 106 and Section 110 that I mentioned, those are very different approaches. They tend to be fast. Due to regulatory time limits, we're expected to turn them around in 30 to 45 days. They're less of an iterative process with lots of back and forth between the applicants and staff, in that they're typically done by a third party and sent to us wholesale, and either it's ready or it's not, and we give a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Sometimes if we have significant questions about where we disagree with the evaluation, we can send it back to the federal agency from where the 110 or 106 evaluation originated and said, we really need you to do X, Y, and Z. And sometimes they have to go through a whole process of allocating funding in order to pay the consultant more money to respond to our questions. So it's something that we tend to be a little more careful about. And they also, evaluations like this, like I mentioned, they do result in formal determinations of eligibility or ineligibility, but they are not eternal. They're considered out of date after 5 years, and a property that was found ineligible can later be found eligible, and vice versa, by subsequent analysis or by the production of new information. That said, they're often really fascinating properties. And the ineligible properties versus non-viable nominations is an issue. We talked about most of the returns that we do, or most of the properties that don't get listed. It's not because we don't think the properties are viable. It's because the applicant isn't able to make the case. And generally, our practice is that we log in any nomination, even if we know it's not going to fly, so we can generate a formal return letter and it can be tracked in our registration log database. Otherwise, there's no record that the nomination even existed, and there's no way to go back and check and find out which nominations were returned. The part of what I use is some of these applications that I'm showing pictures of today are from returned nominations, and I wouldn't even know where to look if we didn't track them by including them in our database. They're almost always properties that may be eligible, and evaluating whether that nomination isn't viable takes time. It's not something we can know as soon as it comes in the door. Adam, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks, William. Is there a common shortcoming to the nominations that get returned?
As I mentioned, typically it's not that we think the property couldn't be eligible. It's that the nomination doesn't make a case for eligibility, and in whatever contact we make with the applicant, that it doesn't look like they're going to be able to fill in that gap. Occasionally, we'll read through a nomination, and like I said, it takes some time to do that. It's not something we can do just rifling through it the first day, and it doesn't make the case, or it's old enough and there's some interesting things about it, but the case for eligibility isn't there, and that's when we would initiate a return.
And do you feel that that's because it's missing information, or that no matter if it has all the information there, it's just, it doesn't meet criteria standards?
I have no way of telling all of the information about a property from what's submitted in a National Register nomination, and I'd fall back actually on the next point that we get from the keeper, that says that the keeper never returns a nomination and said this property isn't eligible. They always say, we are returning this nomination because it doesn't make the case for eligibility. They never actually make a decision about the property that it can't be eligible, that it wouldn't be eligible, just that we haven't made the case. There may be other information out there to make that case, but it's not in this document, and that's where it has to be to get it listed. Commissioner Hanson?
Thanks.
Yes, I just had a question regarding the second bullet on the non-viable nominations. And I was just wondering, in those cases, would you, or are you reluctant to, suggest, if you really just believe somebody, just like you said, does not have the skills necessary to do this, that they work with somebody who does? Or I mean, I know there's a sticky situation with that probably. And then of course, some of the people that do are going to charge money. And of course, you don't want to encourage people to have to spend a lot of money to do a nomination. But I just know in my personal professional life, I actually picked up on quite a few National Register nominations that probably were in the non-viable category, and, brought them to a state where they did go forward and get nominated.
Yeah. Hiring a professional is always advisable. It is not required. There is no requirement, as you know,
Right.
that an applicant for the National Register have any kind of qualifications or official certification. Anyone can do it, but you have to be able to do a certain amount of technical writing for the nomination to be viable. So in some cases, we have recommended either you or someone else needs to take a closer look at this, which might involve hiring a professional, but that's really up to you.
Okay.
Rather than,
And I'll just say that the state cannot recommend to anybody,
Right.
any consultants or contractors. It's prohibited. So
Right.
correct. We never recommend specific contractors.
And really, really, really quick, it's the hardest part of my job, Janet. I mean, I talk to people every day, all the time, and the standards are just so, you have to write at the university minimum, a good university writer, and probably a graduate level writer.
Yeah.
And so how do you encourage people at the same time? You kind of, know that it's very hard. And the cost right now, from what I understand, is $30,000 for a
Yeah.
single, Okay. Anyway, that's enough from me. I'm sorry.
And as we've mentioned elsewhere in this presentation, we've had nominations from very skilled do-it-yourselfers who have, in some cases, started their own consulting practices, and we've received non-viable nominations from people who are professionals in the field. So just the name on the application doesn't necessarily mean the nomination is automatically going to be viable or not.
If I might just say, I don't know if you guys are gonna talk about this, so you can tell me if you are, and I'll be quiet, but just about the multiple property documents that we're creating and their purpose. Are we gonna go over those?
Not the one we're creating, but I am going to be mentioning some multiple property documents
Great.
later on in the presentation. Thank you.
Great.
And then preparation for hearing. When we believe a nomination is fully viable, when we've answered those questions to the satisfaction of staff, that's when we schedule it for commission hearing. And then we post the nomination on our website 60 to 65 days in advance, send out our legal notifications, and follow up with our electronic binders for commissioners. And the nomination that we post, that's the entire nomination document. and from beginning to end. So it's a complete record for review and analysis by the public. And the intent of doing so, in addition to the fact that it's legally required of us, is so the public has the opportunity to read the whole document and provide their comments on the eligibility. And that's where that public comment process exists. And then commission review as a public process means that not only does the public have the opportunity to review the documents, they have the opportunity to be heard. And until a nomination is ready for hearing, it isn't necessarily in a state where it's ready to be heard. As we mentioned, before that point, they're drafts, and they're still drafts until they're actually listed. But preliminary drafts may well still have problems, and those problems can be resolved by interaction with the staff. And sometimes there may be, if it's especially if it's a well-known nomination or a contentious nomination, information that comes in prior to hearing is also included in public comment, and it's not something that is excluded. Any comment that's provided to our office becomes part of the public record and becomes very often part of what we analyze. In some cases, letters of support or objection can be very simple and very concise. In other cases, people will provide entire documents or previous evaluations, which all inform the process. And okay, Commissioner Sherrera?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that when there's a nomination that includes confidential archaeological information, that posting is the redacted version of that nomination.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you. Commissioner Hanson?
Yes, I just had a question regarding staff report. Are those considered the summary reports that we get with our binders?
Yeah, I think people are very used to the term, and it's something we have used, but it's a fairly recent transition. But what we receive is, because we're not providing a formal recommendation, our decision is not a formal evaluation. Rather than use the staff report, the term nomination summary provides a more accurate reflection of what that document actually is, where it summarizes the case made by the applicant for eligibility, followed by public comment or note of opposition or CLG comments, and then ending with the brief recommendation of staff and the legal areas under which it's nominated.
And does the public see those reports, or just commissioners?
They're dynamic documents, so they aren't posted on our website as part of our process, and because they're not even written when we originally post the nomination. So there isn't a nomination summary to post 65 days in advance.
We'll tend to give anything anybody wants, as long as it's not, but generally William's correct. I mean, they change, but yeah. I supply mine if I'm asked.
Yeah, if someone contacts me and asks for a copy of the nomination summary, I can supply it in PDF form, but it depends on the request.
Thank you.
All right, and then of course, as the SHPO mentions, the commission action is not the final decision. From there, except in the case of the California Register, when the commission votes, that's immediately listed in the California Register. But there's still review that goes on beyond that. The information that we provide to the keeper may require a final review or final verification that maps are correct, or other sorts of minor text edits, and that's not substantial changes. It's not substantive changes, but sometimes there's something you don't catch until the very end, and the public interest isn't served by leaving a mistake in a nomination or a typographical error and having it be caught in DC. We correct it on our end before we forward it. Transitioning to our discussion of integrity. The 7 aspects of integrity are indicated here, and they're almost on the continuum, where some are very concrete and something that can be proven or disproven. In other cases, they're more subject to interpretation and based on the analysis of the applying party. And as we'll see with many of these aspects of integrity, a lot of these programs are a lot of the aspects of integrity are not set. And over time, the way that we have analyzed historic integrity has changed. One document that was produced in 2012, a report called The Legacy of California's Landmarks, a report for the California Cultural and Historical Endowment by Donna Graves, analyzed California's historic properties and how they are reviewed. And one of the critiques leveled against the National Register process was discussion of integrity and whether or not current standards and traditional standards of historic integrity successfully were able to capture historic sites where the integrity wasn't something obvious, where it's not something where a member of the public would look at a building and go, oh, that's a historic building, as many extraordinarily significant historic events have taken places in very mundane places and very important places that are deserving of commemoration and listing in the National Register. And so part of the efforts of this field of historic preservation over the past decade is how to make the register more inclusive. And in part, that's because of reports like this and ongoing discussions by California Preservation Foundation, by the National Trust, all saying we need to look at integrity differently, and we need to ensure that this is really reflecting the history of the United States and the history of California. Integrity of location is probably the simplest. Is it in the same location where it was? The murals of Chicano Park are right where they always have been on the supports for Interstate 5 and on its transition to the Coronado Bay Bridge in San Diego. So they have integrity of location because they are in the same place. The Nicholini Winery in Napa Valley, this building held up by a couple of 2x4s, also has integrity of location. It's in the same place where it was. There are certain conditions where a property can still be eligible if it's relocated, but it's one of the things that we look for. Integrity of design. This is Capitol Towers in Sacramento, California, and it includes a lot of integrity of design simply because buildings weren't altered or changed. So the design ideas of the buildings themselves and of the public artwork are largely intact. And this decorative wall. The integrity of design of the Zane Grey Pueblo in Avalon, which was a nomination that was passed by the commission but returned by the keeper, was lost in many ways because of modifications during its era as a hotel, including loss of vigas on the exterior and addition of new buildings on the back that significantly compromised the design. So while it does retain some aspects of integrity, it doesn't retain all of them. And then there's aspects of setting. This car barn on the southern edge of San Francisco, when it was built, it was a vacant area without a whole lot of properties around it because it was a new suburb. But part of the purpose of a streetcar line was to stimulate growth. And so over the course of its existence, it became, rather than mostly open fields, became a bustling city around it. And then a portion of the car barn, the car barns on the left were lost, and there's just the building in the corner there today. But it was listed and found eligible because it retained sufficient integrity, including the integrity of setting in its transition from being the outer end of the city to being a fully built out neighborhood. Huntington Beach Public Library also retains integrity of setting. It had a significant corner lot with landscape around it. And that landscape, we often take a much closer look at landscape architecture and the plants and natural environment around a building rather than just the building itself when considering setting. Materials means, is it built out of the same stuff? This is the ship of Theseus, or my grandfather's axe, or my grandmother's broom question. This octagon barn actually had a lot of siding replaced. It was originally redwood siding, but when it was restored, they actually did underwater archaeology to pull redwood logs that were lost, that were originally carried in bundles, as you heard about with the dog hole porch nomination, through the coast, along the coast, and sometimes where they broke free and would sink, people dug up those logs and used them to create old growth redwood planks without having to chop down any new old growth redwood trees to restore this barn. So it was replaced earlier. If a window is replaced by it can fool an architectural historian, then you can say it does have integrity of materials because it was replaced in kind of similar enough type and style where it doesn't compromise the integrity of materials of the rest of the building. The same way, this freeway from LA to Pasadena, it lost some integrity of materials when guardrails were placed from a more rustic wooden design to more matte, more hit strike resistant. I think they're called K rails that you can see here. So it lost some integrity, but not so much that it lost integrity entirely. Workmanship we're getting more into individual evaluation, and often a building that hasn't been restored has a higher degree of integrity of workmanship because the hands of the people who originally designed and built the building, their work is still evident. Even a replacement means that it's no longer the same piece of materials, even if it's identical. But in some cases, like the Boyle Hotel in Boyle Heights in Los Angeles County, they replaced the corner feature as part of part one as a tax credit project, I believe, and so it did retain sufficient integrity of workmanship to convey its significance through use of like materials and close eye on the architectural design. Feelings were really getting into a subjective area here, and feeling in the case of the San Marino adobe is a transition like with setting from a rural adobe to a building that's located in the middle of a high school. So it does have some dramatic change, but it was still eligible. The Bayshore Roundhouse, just south of San Francisco, that the reeds that you see on the left are inside the turntable pit of this roundhouse. It's got about 5 feet of water and tules sticking out of it. Half of the property burned down, and it was still listed as an eligible property as a roundhouse, in part because even though there's significant changes and loss of materials and loss of a lot of setting, there's still enough sense of a railroad property here, a roundhouse, that to convey its significance. Historic integrity versus structural integrity is mentioned a lot. People go, oh, well, this building's fallen down. It doesn't retain integrity. Structural integrity and historic integrity have nothing to do with each other, and often they counter each other. Because a building like that building in Napa, the Cellini Winery, which is held up by a couple of 2x4s, it's in its original location. It's the original materials. It's not. Yes, it needs help to stay up, and it probably needs restoration. But it has a high degree of historic integrity because it wasn't fixed. Some cases, association is a major factor. This Southern Pacific passenger car in Sacramento County was delisted. It was originally listed along with a train station in Folsom, but the problem is that this particular passenger car was not ever operated on the route near this Folsom Southern Pacific depot. And so, but it might be eligible in its own right as a Southern Pacific passenger car, as an object or a structure, but it wasn't associated with the property that had been nominated under, so it went through the delisting process successfully. In the case of the Wild Goose, which was originally a minesweeper and later became John Wayne's personal boat, his yacht, he modified this ship extensively, including making the decks higher so the very tall John Wayne could fit through the passages in the boat that were often designed for sailors of much shorter stature. But it's associated principally, or it's eligible principally for its association with John Wayne, one of the most celebrated stars of the 20th century cinema. Under criterion B, which, as Jay mentioned, is often more challenging a criterion to list properties under. I apologize for the automatic advancement. And the other question when asked, looking at a nomination, what is the context? Does the historic integrity, not just its original construction, but the period of significance, the reason for which it is being nominated, have those alterations gained significance in their own right? Like the building that Jay showed you at the very beginning. I don't know whether or not that roof is original, but it was a question I asked. And if the answer is that, well, it was added later, but it's part of the significance, then it certainly could be eligible. And then how do we judge the applicable criteria? Now, how do the criteria affect what features are considered when judging integrity? There's some discussion about the California Register. Generally, level of significance is not part of the discussion of whether or not it's California Register or National Register eligible. 90% of the properties listed in the National Register are locally significant. So a locally significant property or a California significant property can still be listed in the National Register. But part of the reason why the California Register was created was to provide a little bit more flexibility. This is back in the early 2000s or the late 90s for properties that might not have sufficient integrity for a National Register listing, but would be able to be nominated under the California Register. And one of the properties we reviewed, this is again about 10 years ago, Self-Help Graphics in Los Angeles, which is a Chicano muralism site and a very modified set of buildings from their original construction in the 1920s. But it's a property that if we looked at it today, we would look at with very different views, because this is the kind of property that it changed over time, but those changes have become significant in their own right for association with a different historic context. And then criterion C often is the most robust in terms of having to have the highest integrity, because we really are just talking about architecture, about pretty buildings. But within the context of a district, that assemblage, the district can have less integrity than a property that would otherwise be ineligible under C. La Laguna de San Gabriel was originally nominated under the California Register with the assumption that it didn't have sufficient integrity for the National Register, and it was a little bit too new. And then a few years later, it was listed in the National Register of Historic Places using the Latinos in 20th Century California Multiple Property Statement, which actually had to have a couple of additions made to it to account for things like statuary and murals. So this was the work of a master artist whose principal work was in clay sculptures, and this essentially the fake wood and playful fantasy creatures were the highlight of this artist's work. And it's something that 20 or 30 years ago people would have looked past and not considered a historic property, but today it's listed in the National Register for its association. Or one of the properties that was included in the Latinos Multiple Property document were the locations of the Chicano moratorium marches. Commissioner Villano had personal experience with this historic event. And the locations of these marches were principally on city streets. So it's the city streets initially and a few parks that were indicated as these are the historic properties that we're identifying. There's no sign of their passing. It's intangible heritage, but like that Legacy of Landmarks report, that intangible heritage is significant, and these events were significant. And the way that we indicate that a place is important historically, important to our history, is through the National Register process. During that process, there were a couple of properties that were nominated individually in conjunction with the Chicano moratorium events. On the left is the Barrio Free Clinic, and on the right is it's a bar where journalist Ruben Salazar was killed during the events of the moratorium. And the decision was that because these buildings had been physically altered, they were not individually eligible for listing in the National Register, but they were eligible to become contributors to the Chicano Moratorium Historic District. So these are two buildings with very altered facades and nothing other than, in one case, a sign on the building that indicates this is where Ruben Salazar was killed, of their historic events, but they were both found eligible and listed in the National Register. And so it doesn't look historic, or there's nothing historic about this building is often a very reductive statement, because it doesn't have to look historic to be historic. This is a small storefront building in Delano, California. The building on the left and the building on the right are the same building, taken about 50 years apart. It was the headquarters for the National Farm Workers Association. Cesar Chavez and his brother converted this previous storefront building into their offices with their own hands. Today, it is a church. As you can see, the front windows have been enclosed. The single entry door has been changed to a double door, and a lean-to addition has been added to one side. So there have been some changes, fairly noticeable ones, and there's also an addition of the front porch overhang. These changes to the building, however, did not prevent its listing in the National Register of Historic Places at the national level as the starting point for NFWA, their first official headquarters, and as the starting point for the march from Delano to Sacramento, the NFWA. So I don't think that a lot of people looking at the building on the left would immediately recognize that this was a profoundly important historic place to the history of California and our nation, but they would be wrong. The final case study I want to analyze is DeWitt General Hospital, which it was originally built as a military base outside of Auburn, California during World War II in Placer County. It later served as a psychiatric hospital in the 1950s through the 1970s and was later owned by Placer County and used as some of their county headquarters. And in response to a proposal to demolish the entire site for, I believe, a Costco or other commercial building, a group of neighborhood activists, people in the community who were not professional historians, wrote a National Register nomination. This is the original map of DeWitt General Hospital, approximately 100 buildings and structures with a campus-wide indoor circulation system that connected the buildings. Originally, it was intended to keep the buildings hermetically sealed because it was a hospital for infectious disease, and then later for control of the environment when it was a mental health hospital, so that patients could move from building to building without leaving the physical structures of the building. This is how it looks when it was nominated. About more than half of the buildings were demolished. 85% of the indoor circulation system had been demolished. So only a small portion of it was retained. So a much loss of integrity of the district as a whole. In 2004, it was analyzed under Section 106 and determined ineligible for listing in the National Register. And this point was raised by Placer County, who objected to the listing of the property. As a government, they were entitled to provide their case and for their information on why the property wasn't eligible. And so they submitted multiple reports, including the Section 106 review and the result of its evaluation, as well as contemporary analysis for why they felt the property wasn't eligible. But they didn't know the whole story, and there was more information, and that was provided in the National Register nomination, which, in addition to talking about its history as a military base, talked about its history as a mental health hospital, and one of its occupants, Martin Ramirez, who suffered from a diagnosis of schizophrenia, but was an extraordinarily talented artist. A visiting psychiatrist who specialized in art therapy, Dr. Tarmo Pasto, discovered the artwork that Martin Ramirez had been doing inside the hospital using improvised materials, and was amazed by its complexity and the richness of its design. And so the property was nominated under Criterion A for association with that military history, but also under Criterion A and Criterion B for association with Martin Ramirez. And this artist became internationally recognized. And the work of Dr. Pasto was internationally recognized, not only for its value as art, but its value as psychotherapy. And often the repetitious, repeating elements that are evident in Martin Ramirez's artwork are in some ways a physical expression of the repetitious and repeated elements of this standardized military hospital layout of DeWitt General Hospital. He was even commemorated with a postage stamp. So was clearly a place associated with a significant individual, in addition to being an example of military architecture and psychiatric history. And so it was listed in the National Register. And it actually, you can see the boundary here was limited to the areas that retain historic integrity. That's one of the things that is clearly laid out in instructions for writing National Register nominations. Is when you're nominating a property, if there are portions of a district or a large property that have lost integrity, you limit the boundaries of the nomination to only analyze the area that does retain integrity in order to retain focus. And that means that new buildings that had been constructed adjacent to this building didn't need to be considered, other than with the much wider relevance of integrity of setting. And the end result is that because this DeWitt General Hospital was retained by Placer County rather than being demolished, it today serves as a homeless shelter. There are actually multiple shelters providing shelter housing for hundreds of people, and I understand there's a safe ground campsite nearby, and directly adjacent to the property there is new affordable housing that is under construction. So this is one story of a particular property. And it really has to be clarified that every property is unique and needs to be considered individually. And very often it is the subject matter experts, the people of the state of California, who are there to tell us, the government representatives, what is important, what's significant to them. And our job as public servants is to help translate the knowledge of the people of the state into a form that a bureaucrat will understand. That's really what we do. So that is just a brief summary of what we've discussed, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, William. Any questions or comments for William?
And we're the bureaucrats that need to understand this.
William, do you get a lot of delisting requests, and does that come with documentation that a listed or eligible property has since lost enough integrity?
They're relatively rare. People tend to assume they're automatic, but very often, but sometimes we will get proper requests for delisting of properties or alterations to existing properties or districts to reflect changes such as demolition. It's relatively rare that we get a request to delist a property because the information was inaccurate, but sometimes that happens too. And it's going forward. A lot of the older nominations, especially for the California programs for National Register 2, the information in there is very limited. And so sometimes there's a desire to update the information to reflect a fuller story. But more often, rather than delisting, what we're seeing is greater stories being told. So in the larger story of a historic district, there are individual buildings that have their own historic context. And so people will write a nomination for an individual property within that district to tell the fuller story. But delisting is typically, yes, it's associated with buildings that have lost so much integrity that they no longer retain eligibility.
And one follow-up to that, is the process then to submit the delisting request to the keeper? Is it the same reviewer that would look at it, or do you handle that internally?
It's handled in our office, and and then there have been a few cases, I believe, where it's been voted on by the commission.
Yeah, no, you have to unwind it the same way it was wound. I mean, we would bring it to you, and we get, we get inquiries about once every. Sometimes we really don't get any delisting inquiries once a year. We've delisted 2 properties I could think of off the top of my head since I've been here. And they have to write, it's almost, I mean, if the property's burned, if it's completely destroyed, it's easier. But if it's just a loss, I mean, they have to explain why it no longer meets National Register criteria in much the same way you have to explain that it does. I mean, that's what I've been taught. So, and then we would take it to you with a staff report and then send it to the keeper.
Okay. Commissioner Hanson?
Yeah, really just more a comment on the last bullet point regarding integrity and how it's changed over time, principally to make the program more inclusive. But I just wanted to commend really the office here generally for thinking so broadly about, what is significant and application of the aspects of integrity. I've done work with lots of other cities and lots of other states, and I think California in many ways is way ahead of the curve on this process of being much more broad-minded and sensitive to how we think about applications of integrity aspects.
Okay. Commissioner Schreier?
I was trying to clap hands. I think that was the emoji I wanted.
Okay.
So, yeah.
I wanted to say thank you for that, Janet, and I think it's reflective of the quality and the professionalism of our staff. and
Mhm.
also what our communities are asking of us and what they're, what they're telling us they want, which is it's their register. Jay always says the National Register is the people's register. And I think we take that to heart in California in ways that maybe might be a little bit different, but it really is intended, I think, we think to be a reflection of our communities and also not set in time. I mean, the 50-year rule in many ways, the further we get past the beginning of the country, the 50-year rule seems like a short amount of time. But I think because it didn't say there were limited numbers or a certain date, the National Register anticipates always changing and growing. And so for that reason, we should be doing that in the ways and the values that our communities change and mature into as well. So it's really in response to what the public is asking for. And I think that they're getting more engaged and more sophisticated, and many, many more people, particularly from underrepresented communities, are really finding their voice in the National Register in these amazing ways. And we're all much better for the richness that they bring to the registers that we administer.
All right.
Julie, with respect to the 50-year rule, I'm seeing more and more of my childhood toys in antique shops, and I don't like it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think all the commissioners are eligible for the National Register now.
Thanks again, William. And something tells me that maybe Amy is next. That's a clue.
I wanted just to ask, does anybody need a break? Are we still good to continue? You don't have to vote, so there doesn't need to be a quorum. So if the commissioners need to get up and stretch your legs, please feel free.
I don't hear Amy.
Well, Jay, were you still going to talk about the criteria considerations? 'Cause
You know, I hope it doesn't disappoint anyone, but I very briefly, we could, I did not prepare to give examples of every property type that falls under the criteria considerations, right? But the question that was presented that I read was criteria considerations. When are they used and when should they be avoided? And I've never thought of them as something to avoid. They're just a tool to use. And I love the language of the bulletins. I always say that. So I'm just going to give you a brief introduction. Certain kinds of properties are not usually considered for listing in the National Register. Religious properties, moved properties, birthplaces and graves, cemeteries, reconstructed properties, commemorative properties, and properties achieving significance within the last 50 years. These properties can be eligible for listing if they meet special requirements called the criteria considerations. And so I think, today that's the most important thing I wanted to convey. Real briefly, religious properties, because the federal government can't be seen to be favoring one religion over another. So it's, religious properties are often eligible then for historical reasons, the role that the community played in the role that the group played in the community, the architecture of the building. And even in rare circumstances, if a religious group played this highly significant role in history, then in limited circumstances, you can even nominate for that reason. Moved properties we've dealt with, moved properties aren't normally eligible. There are criteria considerations though that allow moved properties to be listed. I'm not going to continue to go through them all, but reconstructed properties is interesting. They're not eligible unless they were constructed as part of a larger plan for a district, or they're in an appropriate setting, suitable environment. So I think of the criteria considerations of ways or rules that a normally not eligible property must meet in order for it to be eligible. right? Criteria consideration G, I think, is probably the most common. Even if a period of significance bleeds into a period less than 50 years of age, we need to cite criteria consideration E or G to explain how the property was exceptionally significant during those years that are less than 50 years ago, right? So the particulars can get very technical, but I just mostly today wanted to convey that they're used to facilitate the nomination of properties that are normally excluded from the National Register. And if there's any questions, I can answer them. I'll try to answer them. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Amy. Oh, I do have one other comment, though. Following up on some of the conversations that just took place this morning, when I sat down to my computer at home over my coffee, I saw an article, Diverse Voices, the Changing Face of Curating. A new generation of curators is opening galleries up to work from underrepresented artists from all parts of the art world. And I thought, boy, there's some parallels there with what we do with the National Register today. Just thought I would share that. All yours, Amy.
Thanks, Jay.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to talk about how to support or object to a National Register listing and how property owners are involved, obviously based on your questions, with an emphasis on providing information to those property owners who are objecting to the nomination. So this information is available on our website all the time. We also provide it as an enclosure with the notification hearing letters that go out 65 days before the hearing. Next, anyone can nominate a property owner, a community advocate, and either a professional or a non-professional on behalf of the owner or the advocate. The consent of the property owner is not required, but I think all of us have, a similar conversation with people who call or email to inquire about nomination, is that the owner is going to be notified when the nomination is scheduled for hearing. And so we really encourage the owner to have a conversation, we encourage the preparer to have a conversation early on with the property so that they're not blindsided and so that they have a chance to ask some questions, get some information, find out about the benefits and the effects of this. Next. So part of the nomination submittal package is a cover letter that includes property owner. The National Register nomination forms from several years ago used to have an owner panel. I think it was like section, it was somewhere towards the end, like 9 or 10 or something before they renumbered it. And then for protection of ownership information and due to privacy concerns, in one of the revisions, the National Park Service took that section out of the nomination. So we require that information be provided to us up front in the nomination. If a private property owner objects, then the ultimate action would be a determination of eligibility. And then if a property owner wanted to receive any of the benefits listing as opposed to determination of eligibility, they would then need to revoke that objection. And the Park Service has actually made the process of objecting a little bit easier, and that may be a result of the pandemic and people doing things more digitally, not going out and about. It used to require a notarized statement. Someone actually had to go print a form, sign it, take it to somebody. And the Park Service has simplified things. There is now language that people can basically say that what they are saying is true, and they're not committing perjury. And we've updated our guidance to property owners to reflect that new language. But again, circling back to the idea of benefits and potential tax credits, this is one of the things when we have an extended conversation with someone on the phone, if they're wondering what is this process mean for them? Do they want the additional government involvement, or kind of what's in it for them? We do point out that many of the communities do have local benefits, such as the Mills Act. That of course there is the federal tax credit program, and now of course California has a state tax credit program. So we try and give them some balance if they're looking at not wanting some sort of imposition. We try and give them some guidance as to what some of the benefits are as well. Next. So I wanted to give you a case study. So William, if you could advance the slide, and then these next two will go fairly quickly. That may have gone back instead of forward.
Amy, can I interrupt you just a little bit? I think some
Sure.
of us are having trouble with the audio. I don't know if it's possible to get closer to the mic or if it's just my audio, but you seem to be choppy a little bit.
I'm having trouble as well. Do you have a headset, Amy, maybe? You can
I
plug into-
don't, and this is actually the same setup that I've used for the last 2.5 years. So, and I closed down all the other programs I had going on my computer. So I'll just try and project a little more.
Thank you.
All right, so Beverly Fairfax Historic District is a neighborhood of 463 residential properties in central Los Angeles. They were developed between 1924 and 1949. The district predominantly contains two-story multifamily residences designed in period revival styles, retaining a high level of integrity. And I believe that when this nomination was heard by the commission, all of you were on the commission. It might have been the first meeting for some of you, but this may look and sound a bit familiar for you. Next. The district is also significant as an early Jewish enclave, representing the earliest movement of Los Angeles' Jewish community westward from areas like Boyle Heights in the late 1920s and the 1930s. Next. By 1940, at least 2/3 of the district's population was Jewish, including first-generation Americans, longtime Los Angeles residents, and Holocaust survivors, for whom Beverly Fairfax provided a safe community in which to rebuild their lives. The district remains strongly associated with Los Angeles' Jewish community. Next, please. The National Register nomination effort was notable for the degree of resident-initiated involvement. In 2016, a proposed series of major developments in close proximity to the district caused concern that the historic identity and unique character of Beverly Fairfax would soon disappear as well. Next. A volunteer committee of 6 residents formed Save Beverly Fairfax to explore how to best preserve architectural and cultural history of the neighborhood. Next. Advocates spent over a year and a half cultivating relationships with neighbors and homeowners through mailings and meetings, and raised funds to hire a preservation consultant to write the nomination. Next. Outreach efforts included posting flyers on neighborhood light poles, holding mixers at local eateries, distributing free lawn signs, sending information to all property owners, and even running a neighborhood lemonade stand to share information. And it's important to point out that this happened long before the nomination even came into our office. Next, please. More than 200 signatures and emails of support were collected from residents. And so they hired Architectural Resources Group to complete a district survey and draft the nomination. Next. Beverly Fairfax Historic District achieved listing on the National Register of Historic Places on October 4th, 2018. In August of 2019, residents celebrated a sign unveiling with a street fair. And the street fair was such a success that they decided to turn this into an annual block party. For this community-driven effort to recognize and preserve a neighborhood's cherished heritage, Save Beverly Fairfax received a 2019 Governor's Historic Preservation Award. Next, please. And then the one after that. Okay. So a notification of hearing letter is sent to owners of record 65 days prior to the meeting. It's the preparer's responsibility to provide that list of owners and mailing addresses. For federal regulations, it needs to be at least 30, but not more than 75 days before the state review board meeting. And again, for the regulations, the list of owners shall be obtained from either official land reclamation records or tax records, whichever is more appropriate, within 90 days prior to the notification of intent to nominate. Next, please. That letter, which goes out over the SHPO signature, identifies some of the effects and benefits of listing. First of all, it identifies what the National Register is. It emphasizes that listing in the National Register assures review of federal projects. So it's less what impacts what other private owners do, but really to put up some caution if a federal project might impact the public. And we do let people know that as of January 1st, 1993, all National Register properties are automatically listed in the California Register. Next. The letter also includes the statement that listing will not attach restrictive covenants or try to require it, that people are not required to open their homes. And then we do let them know that there are benefits and direct them to the website. Next, please. The letter also provides a mailing address for comments, although of course in this digital age, we are receiving a number of them electronically as well. We provide a link to the draft nomination to the pending nominations page, where the nomination will be posted within a couple of days of this letter going out. And we provide a phone number so that people can ask for a hard copy and ask questions if needed. Next. There are a number of enclosures that come with this letter. We send them a notice that tells them the date, time, and place of the meeting. If the nomination is for a district, we provide a map that shows the boundary and contributors and non-contributors within that district. We provide a fact sheet that answers a number of people's questions. And then again, this document with which we started this part of the presentation, how to support or object to a nomination. And so again, that information is available on the website well in advance, but again, we print it out, we include it as an enclosure so that people have that information right. Next. Under federal law, a privately owned property can't be listed over the objection of its owner, or in the case of a property with multiple owners, over the objection of the majority of the owners. The district cannot be listed over the objection of a majority of the owners. So we do keep a careful count as time goes on, keeping track of the number of owners that we've notified and the objections as they come in, if that's approaching anywhere near that majority threshold. Next. So each owner or partial owner of a private property has one vote. So if someone comes in and they own 3 houses in the district, they get one vote. If one building in the district is owned by 3 people, then each of those 3 people gets a vote. And if a property is owned by a trust or an organizational entity, it's the entity that's the owner and gets one vote. Next. So coming back to our case study, property owners with questions about the discretionary use of their property are encouraged to contact their local jurisdiction to hold all land management authority for guidance on how listing may affect them directly, particularly with regard to land use management. So Safe Beverly Fairfax held an informational meeting for property owners and brought in representatives from the LA Office of Historic Resources and the Los Angeles Conservancy. They mailed property owners multiple times to check in, to provide information, and to respond to concerns voiced by some of the property owners. They even had a sheet of frequently asked questions, knowing the kinds of questions that owners were likely to ask, particularly with regard to how they could make changes to their property and what kinds of changes they might be able to make, and whether or not those changes rose to the level of needing permission from the local government. Next. And again, Beverly Fairfax, Save Beverly Fairfax, they encourage their property owners to contact the Los Angeles Office of Historic Resources should they have additional questions or concerns. And so this is obviously something fairly straightforward for properties in places like Los Angeles or San Francisco, where they have dedicated offices for historic resources. Smaller communities may not have a separate office, but we encourage people to start with the planning department, because that's usually where these kinds of questions come. Next. So 10 days before the meeting agenda and the notice of hearing are posted on the Office of Historic Preservation website. And the notice includes this language where we remind people that the commission can only consider evidence that pertains to whether or not a property meets the criteria, and that the commission cannot consider social, economic, or environmental considerations when determining if a property meets the criteria. Sadly, it doesn't seem to matter how many times we say this. There's almost always going to be a property owner who simply doesn't want their property listed because that's their right. But again, if it's economic, if they want to demolish the buildings so that they can build something larger, taller, that would enable them to, rent more units, that's not an issue for National Register. Next, please. So at the hearing, and this is documented in the National Park Services Manual for State Historic Preservation Review Boards, the role of the review board, or for us, the State Historical Resources Commission, in the nomination process is to provide leadership in the recognition of the state's historic properties. And frequently, at least one of you, I've noticed, has actually shared this philosophy, this focus with people attending. Maybe not in exactly these words, but definitely this is the thought that's next. So as you all know, and as we remind our listeners and property owners, those following along with the meeting, that really the commission's focus is the property significant within an appropriate context? Does the property retain integrity? And is the property or the resource appropriately defined, including the extent of the damage? Next. And again, political and economic ramifications shall not be taken into consideration. The purpose is to apply professional, technical standards in an unbiased fashion to determine if properties meet the criteria. Next, please. Now, I know William touched on this a little bit in his presentation about the process overall. The digital submittal to the keeper includes all the correspondence, including letters received after the hearing and before submittal, because we do take maybe a week to 10 days to give the nomination a final proof, get everything organized and submitted to the keeper. The keeper has a 45-day review period. So if we were to receive additional letters after we sent the nomination into the keeper, we would still forward that additional correspondence. And property owners also have the option of submitting letters directly. Next. Property owners can object for any reason at any point in the process. We do encourage them, if they're going to submit a letter, that they do it in a timely fashion so that it can be included with the materials shared with the commission in advance of the meeting, and at the latest with the materials that get forward. What's important for property owners to know that merely by objecting, it doesn't stop the process, and it doesn't change the boundary of the nominated property. And again, frequently we find ourselves reminded of property owners that the local jurisdiction holds all land management. Next. Sometimes there's some confusion about what is covered by the National Register or what is limited by the National Register and what is local land. And we find this happens most frequently with properties in Los Angeles. The city of Los Angeles has I'm preaching to the choir here, telling Janet, Commissioner Hanson, it's local neighborhoods, local historic districts can be designated a historic preservation overlay zone, which I would refer to as an HPOZ, but locals might pronounce that a little bit differently. But it means that any new projects in that neighborhood have to complement. And it's an overlay, so it's an additional layer of planning control. Next. So what frequently happens is that advocates will pursue the local designation as an HPOZ before they pursue National Register designation. So in the case of, say, Beverly Fairfax, this is the front side of a postcard they sent out to hundreds of property owners in the neighborhood. And they wanted to kind of get an initial read whether or not property owners would support the creation of this overlay zone, and then get some. And then they used this information to then move to the next step, which was preparing a national register. They actually told the neighborhood, and in their term, in their language, they specifically said this would preserve the character and charm of our community while protecting our long-term investment property owners. And HPOZ is the only way that we can have a voice and take control of new development in our neighborhood. And what I see here is there's less of an us and them relationship, but the advocates for the nomination and for initially this HPOZ overlay was that they really wanted to be working with the property to let people know that this was a way of everyone being able to celebrate the historic significance of the neighborhood and what benefits could be accrued as a result of the designation. So although these processes are similar, they're also quite different, particularly in terms of who has control and who is managing them. But to many property owners, the distinction is not clear. So when you're reading through some of the letters of objection, you may see references to this overlay zone. Actually, even some of the letters of support that came in refer to the HPOZ rather than National Register designation. So I think sometimes to someone who's not familiar with any of these processes, they hear about the creation of a district or overlay or a name being applied, and it's to some extent all the same to them. So what we try and clarify some. Next, please. So wrapping up, the action taken by the commission does indicate that that you agree that the nominated property is significant, that it retains integrity, and it's appropriate. Next. And one thing that commission approval will not result in immediately following the meeting is automatic California register listing, because that is tied directly to either listing or a formal determination of eligibility by the people. So a property has to be listed in or formally determined eligible for the National Register to be automatically listed. That was a lot faster than I'd originally planned on going through that, but hopefully that's left us some time for questions. And maybe it was all familiar enough that you don't have questions, which would be great. No, Commissioner Hanson.
I know I should know this by now, but please remind me, if property owners within a National Register eligible district object, are they, because it's a district, still listed, or are individual properties left out of the actual listing?
No, there is no cherry picking, or what the National Register refers to, I think, as either donut holes or chocolate chip cookies.
Right.
Somehow all sort of, sweets oriented. But no, if someone objects to having a resource within a district listed, their objection is noted and counted, but their property still remains within.
Okay, thank you.
Amy, can you explain what the threshold is for historic districts, the objections?
Well, it's a majority. So if 51% of the owners object, then the farthest that the property could go would be a determination of eligibility.
Are you all able to hear that? It's 51%. If owners of 51% of a district's owners object, then the only consideration can be eligibility, not actual listing.
And that could actually, in very rare circumstances, apply to an individual building as well if it had multiple owners. You know, say we had a property that maybe was, you know, inherited by multiple children, and say there were 3 children and one of them objected to the nomination, but the other 2 were either neutral or actively in support of it, then it would still be listed. But if it were the reverse, 2 of the 3 owners were actively objecting to the nomination, then the property would only be determined eligible.
And public entities don't have, their objections don't count.
Right. This is all specific to private property owners. So public owners, whether it's, you know, a city or a county, federal agency for a concurrent nomination with the federal and private property, they can make their opinion heard. We encourage them to document it, to include it in correspondence that we can forward to the keeper. But a public entity's objection does not stop the list.
Go
So,
ahead, Adam.
oh, can I just one follow-up question real quick? If 55% of people in a historic district object, you can still bring the nomination forward. Would you still bring it forward to the commission? Yes.
Yes, because we would be looking for the keeper to, you know, to determine that district eligible.
Okay.
And
Okay.
over time, things may change, just as the Park Service has simplified the process for people to object. They've now simplified the process for people to lift objections. Whether it's a private property owner who realizes they want to take advantage of the tax credit, or they've had a chance to talk to their neighbors and they now, you know, see the benefit. Or one of my favorite stories was actually related to a tribal property in Northern California, and the tribe was able to buy the property back. And so they wrote in and they said, we're the owners now, and, you know, we don't object. We want this listing. And so a property that had been only determined eligible basically is now fully listed on the list.
Okay.
Adam, you're on.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to say that we felt this was a really important topic. We see it playing out in commission meetings. We see council and OHP staff doing a great job responding to landowner objections in a public forum. And, you know, sometimes those discussions are contentious. There's a lot that people don't understand about the process, especially private property owners who might not want this to go the direction that it goes. And so I really appreciate you taking the time to break it down for us.
Amy, can I comment on 2 of the nuances to make sure I have it right? On district listings, every co-owner gets 1 vote, but if you have more than 1 property, you only get 1 vote. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. That's interesting. A single house could have 3 votes by 3 different co-owners, and the person that owns 6 houses in the neighborhood gets 1 vote. Okay.
There actually was some effort under the previous administration to change this, and then just I think it was a combination of timing and pushback, and it didn't happen. So this is the way things have been for some time, and look to remain for the National Register.
Did you, I'm sure you mentioned it, but I didn't quite hear if you mentioned that the determination of eligibility by the keeper still results in our state register listing.
Yes, it was on the last slide. That
The last slide.
Formal determination of eligibility by the keeper still results in a property being listed on the California Register, and therefore it would be subject to environmental
Thank you.
Any other questions for Amy? Well, thank you to all three of you. Do we have any, where are we going next for any closing comments?
None from me, really. I just would encourage you to contact us if you have questions. I look forward to further training sessions. I think COVID really intervened with the last few years in this commission. Yeah, that's all. Maybe I'm sure that Julie could also say some closing words.
Yes, thank you. I want to just if the public that are watching now or later, that all of the information that staff covered can be found on our website. Maybe not in the exact form, but the information on the topics are at www.ohp.ca.gov. We'll also be making the recording of this meeting available on our office YouTube page so that it can be watched on demand. And again, if there are any questions, please feel free to contact us. Our information, email addresses for staff and our desk phone numbers, probably better to use email since we're still working remotely, are also on our website under each of the sections so that staff can the public can easily contact staff with any questions. And like Jay said, if the commissioners have any other questions or there are things that weren't covered that you would like us to address in a future workshop, we're happy to do so. I'm wondering if I might ask Adam, as the committee chair, what's next on the docket for the workshop in January?
Thanks, Julie. We had thought about asking Commissioner Hess to spend some time in the January workshop covering his area of expertise and giving us kind of a tutorial on how architecture would be best represented in these nominations. So especially those of us who aren't coming to the commission with that background can really leverage his experience when reviewing these nominations for architectural properties.
Very good.
Yeah, I'm glad to do that. I can't repeat what Amy and William and Jay have done today, as it'll be very different in terms of themes, styles, purposes, history, historical context, and so forth. That's what I imagine. But if any of you have any particular questions about the subject that you want addressed, do let me know.
Yeah, thank you. I also want to say that we'll probably have an update in January to the contract we let with the Getty to do a feasibility study about changing their 20th century context document into a California specific multiple property document form. So we'll give an update about that at the next commission meeting as well. I'm myself anxious and curious to see how that's going to be possible. And then we'll also bring updates of our other multiple property document forms that we're in the process of working on or completing, both to tomorrow's meeting and to the January meeting, with an aim to think about how we are going to promote the existence of those documents and how we can help encourage the public to use them for future nominations, which is exactly their purpose. And just be prepared tomorrow to have your calendars ready to talk about commission meetings. I know you all filled out Google polls, but we'll talk about the upcoming meetings in the next year at tomorrow's meeting as well. And that's all I have, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for that, Julie. Any other questions or comments before we go? I was just going to mention, as much as COVID has impacted us from not being able to be in the same room, and I miss seeing all of you in person, I will say this: it is amazing what it's done for public participation. And it'll be interesting to see how the state deals with that in the future. I also want to again thank Jay, William, Amy, and Julie for today, and also to Commissioner Suero and Commissioner Hoyos for putting these together. So if there's nothing else today. I will adjourn us workshop, and I will see all you happy faces at 9 o'clock tomorrow.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Take care.
You.
Bye.